Hi, I'm Martha Zackwitz, and welcome to Corner of Fifth Street Talk. This is where we share insights about fashion apparel, retail beauty, technology, retail real estate, and more, while also answering this key question: what does retail mean to you? Today, we welcome Ward Kampf, who's the president of Northwood Retail. Ward, thank you so much for stopping by today.
Thank you for having me, Arthur. Looking forward to our conversation.
So let's kick off right off the bat here. And Ward, you've been vocal about Northwood avoiding the commoditized retail trap. When you walk into a potential new acquisition, what's the first red flag that pops out and tells you that the property is stuck in the past?
I think there's a couple that we just kind of keep top of mind. Configuration's becoming a really big, deal. Just configuration of the center, and there's a lot of trends that go with that, whether it's e-commerce, Uber, driverless cars. It's really starting to register. And then we look at, kind of the tenant mix, tenancy. We think about legacy tenants, and then, can we kind of bring our special sauce? So those are the red flags are definitely layout and just, great demographics, access, et cetera. And so those are some of the things. And then just, the legacy tenants, type of tenants, et cetera. And we also look at bays,
Okay.
tenants have gotten a lot smaller, a lot more efficient. So that's something that we pay attention to is depths. So bay depths.
What do shoppers expect in a physical retail experience? What are they looking to do?
I think there's, that's a good question in today's environment, right?
Yeah.
I think, time is the new currency, right? And has been. And we've been fighting this battle with, online e-commerce, et cetera. But I think, we still focus on, the woman shopper, and I think part of it is you want to be in really good demos and you want to be, in her path on her way. And whether that's, she's dropping the kids off at school, she's going to grab coffee, she or he's going to go to yoga in the morning, are they going to go to lunch? And then are they going to make it a full shopping experience? But I think you definitely want to be in the path of, convenience is really, really critical. And then just have a full collection, have the best tenants, the freshest merchandise, whether it's food, fashion, even some of the medtel we're seeing, or, tenants that are, we're seeing a lot come out of the technology space that is non-Apple, whether it's Google, Meta, et cetera. So, those are all important ingredients, of what people want today.
And what about, they want discovery too. They want new things.
You're 100% right.
Right. So and you describe retail as content, almost something that's curated. So how do you balance your anchor tenants with these new, freshly minted emerging brands that come out? How do you do that?
Yeah. So, I started in the mall. I was a mall rat, 35 years ago. And, it was always about scale, big spaces, chain retail, department stores. And I think today, they're looking for newness.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of trends, right now, baggy jeans, flats, on the fashion side. And I think, the traditional way of thinking of retail, I think for 35 or 40 years from kind of the late 60s or early 70s, there's just this suburban growth of malls. We built, 12 to 1,400 of them, and we just kept going out every 5 miles, and we commoditized it. And you could basically, it's up the best demos. If you go back to the core of where the really good incomes are, the further you get out, there's less density, less daytime population. And so I think that's where things went wrong. And then we just kind of duplicated that across America. And that's not what shoppers are looking for today. They're looking for this newness, as you talked about. How does technology play into that? Your phone's the first thing you look at in the morning, last thing you look at night, hours, all that type of stuff, ordering, how you pay for stuff. Like there's a real shift and a real disruption that's happened in retail in the last 15 or 20 years.
I grew up on Long Island in the 70s, and I think it was the Smith Haven Mall.
Yeah.
It was like a magical place. Like, you go in and, there was an Orange Julius, right? And it was food, and, there was a movie theater they put in there, and it was so much more exciting than the suburban block we lived on. And it had a stickiness to it, right? So,
yeah.
And I think in an interesting way, I think, especially Gen Z, like, I see them walking through the mall and they have their phones, but they're spending a day there, obviously, and they're looking for like Instagrammable moments. So this the stickiness that's a is there some sort of vibe or energy that's required to make that happen today versus maybe in the past? Is it different somehow?
Well, I think you're talking about, the generation. You're right. The Gen Z, there's been a couple articles recently about the resurgence of the mall. I think TikTok's played into that. Instagram's played into that. So I think you've got to incorporate whether you're, we own open air centers where, you've got to play into that, right? Whether it's having a La La Land coffee where, people, the young love to go there, and we've got a couple La La Lands. And so I think you're right. I do think, they make a day of it with their phones. I mean, kids today, they can sit there and be right across from each other, texting each other. They don't talk, but they're very enamored with TikTok and Instagram. So that's kind of one demographic. And I break this down, Arthur, to a couple things. Demographics always drove the suburban growth. And now we've got kind of a skew, right? We've got Z, X, millennials, and then we have these baby boomers that, where there's a lot of wealth, and their experience of shopping is probably eating out, some of the medtail and then traveling. So they have a totally different way of looking at, what their day looks like shopping. She may go get her hair done. Whereas the young, you're right, there's this sticky part or this newness. And you look at some of these tenants, this addicted tenant that's come out of, Los Angeles. We're doing a deal with him. It's insane, the volumes, but he was born, on TikTok and started at the Grove, and his, volumes they're nuts. I think when people say, how do you balance the anchors versus the newness? I think, you think about Apple or Trader Joe's, or, Trader Joe's is 12,500 feet. Apple's less than 10. Or authoritative food, that's where people want to go. And then you kind of round the mix out from that rather than this big regional hangout. I do think there's a place for malls. I think there's a lot less. And, the department store scenario is still going to play out. And then movies, when you ask about what do you look for when you're looking at a center, we just bid on a center where the movie theater, blew up. And so it's something that's been on our radar. Again, a lot of disruption in retail and shopping centers.
You mentioned demographics. Like, what data do you look at specifically when you're considering, a site? What are the key data points?
I think I think a lot of it is spending power, average age. We look at is it young? Is it 32 to 43, kind of in some of these really affluent areas? You definitely see it skew a little bit. The numbers skew a little bit higher, obviously, because it's, more costly to live. So I would say we look at incomes for sure. We look at the drivers, are there drivers like up in San Mateo, we're in the world of tech, up in the Valley. In Austin, kind of the same thing, where we have technology around us, Samsung just to the north, Apple's campus. And then, MD Anderson just announced they're going to do, a world-class medical center across the street from us 2 weeks ago. So those type of drivers, were under contract to buy a center right across from a hospital. Those, during the day, those drive people, right? So, we look at a multitude of factors, but it's really, how does it perform? You can't, you got to be able to layer the day. You want her there in the morning, whether she's getting coffee or the kids are getting a coffee on their, before they go to school. Is somebody there at lunch? And then did they go there for dinner? So you want the whole day experience. And so that's really what we're looking for is traffic and, how to drive sales, obviously, and productivity.
With the district in West Palm Beach nearing completion, what makes that market in particular different from your projects in Nashville or Austin? Is there a Florida blueprint for retail right now?
Well, you see, the news of the day this morning, Howard Schultz moving from Seattle to Florida, that's a headline. And that's, somebody followed a text, a good friend of mine said the transfer portal is now open. And I thought that was kind of funny, but, in seriousness, this is happening quick, and so the South Florida blueprint, you look at Sergi Brin and the people that have moved there, it's happening at light speed. And so, leading up to now, before, there were things like taxes being thrown on people, people were already going there for the
Right.
quality of life. I think that was partly demographics. Palm Beach is an anomaly. Miami, one of the top 10 world destinations, whether people refute that or not, it is a truly worldly definite, destination. So, that spurs up into, and you think about what Miami has with Design District, Brickell up in Palm Beach, you've got Worth Avenue that's always had the money. There's just, the district feels like just an extension, and then it goes up into Naples, what's happening in Naples as well. So the blueprint and even Tampa, and the volumes are rivaling, Manhattan for some of these retailers, especially the contemporary and the luxury. So you guys may be an anomaly in
Right.
West Palm and Southern Florida, other than Dallas, Austin, maybe Houston.
So yes, yeah. Speaking of Austin, what's the Spider-Man? What's his uncle say? With the great strength or power comes responsibility, or something like that, right?
Yeah.
So you've in Austin, you've essentially created a second downtown with the Domain Northside. What are the challenges when you do that? When you create a city within a city versus a traditional like shopping center?
Yeah, I think, one thing, it's an asset, it's 38 acres. We partnered, with the guys that originally bought the domain. It was 300 acres total. The last 38 acres we developed. And I would say, we have all 4 asset classes on site. We have a hotel, the Archer. We have retail, some of the best retail. I think we brought 85 first new tenants to the market, almost 30 DTC tenants, so digitally native, born online, direct to consumer. So that's something, we thought about. So the newness is there. Then we have office, and we have about 600 apartment units. So the complexity of running a small city, it's about a 20-hour day. And if you think about some of the bars or restaurants closing at 2 or 3, some of the workout and coffee you can get as early as 5. So you only really have about 3 hours of downtime.
Right.
And then the complexities are, what I would say are there, people, this happened maybe a year ago. Somebody was moving in the apartments. The stove was on. There was a box, started a fire, and it was on a Sunday, and like 3 retail tenants were closed for the day while they were dealing with it. So, that's a minor complexity that we see at some of the mixed use assets, but it's super complicated. And then, something we try to really focus on is making sure it's clean and safe, because it is a small city. And if people think it's clean and it's safe, they'll live there, they'll shop there, they'll eat there, they'll office there, they'll stay there. So it's something we put a lot of thought in, is just, people making sure it's clean, power washed, painted, up to date, but then just the safety, of everyone that visits there. So we take that top of the list.
When I first started reporting, 30 years ago, there was, real estate and brokers and real estate executives, they wore trench coats and they smoked cigars, and it was the tenant, and it was like a one-way relationship. And I think that's changed. Like, I think today it's a different culture, right? And maybe tenants are more like partners in success, right? What else has changed, like over the time that you've been, kind of in the industry?
Yeah, I'd say, the rule of thumb, people were always very nervous about putting too much food together. And, I think food, with e-commerce, I think something that's changed a lot, is a lot of tenants have e-com data, and they know exactly where their clientele is. And so, they know where they want to be, what's within a quarter of a mile. They can drill it down. They have that data. They can see it. Well, with retailers all the time, it's becoming more and more important. In the old days, you're right. It was, the big guys kind of, would take their mall portfolio in and say, here's 20 or 30 deals we can do. Here's our A centers, here's our B centers, and here's our C centers. And, they'd come up with a structure, and, that's played out. Simon kind of did his deal, got, big is big. Was that the best? I think content and context, meaning, if your asset's smaller, easier, and you have the right tenant mix, whether it's food, the technology tenants, some of the best fashion tenants, because there's a lot going on in fashion, baggy jeans are in. I think that's the really important point, is being very selective, curating something versus just saying we're this, vast mall that's 1 million or 2 million square feet. You're going to spend 3 or 4 hours. And again, I go back to you're fighting convenience.
Yeah.
Deliveries, buy online, pick up in store is a very, very important part of a retailer's omni-channel. And so that's why I go back to configuration. Can you handle that? It's hard to do a buy online, pick up in store when you're located on the second level of the mall and somebody has to run it down to you, right? So just little things like that are different. Yeah.
What you talk about the curation of that? How do you do that? It sounds more like a combination of science and art, right? If I come to you and I'm a fashion brand, I don't want to be next to a competitor, right? So that plays into it. What else goes into that recipe?
I think we've done it long enough that, my career, I've been fortunate enough. I did the, second RH store in the country with Gary before he even had a store open. We did the second Tree Food with Sam Fox, the third Dry Bar. It's all these concepts were newer, and you got to put yourself out there and battle a little bit on who's the founder of the business, because we put a lot of emphasis on founder businesses. And can you pick up the concept really quick? Are you going to overanalyze it? It's not all about the rent. It's about, can you find the right tenants, right tenancy? And the rest of the tenants will start to show up, or they'll come to you and say, hey, can we do more things together? These are the markets we'd like to be in. So it has changed a lot, but the success of it is putting a full collection of retail together and food where somebody wants to go and spend some time and not be on their phone and shop, and make a day of it or half a day of it.
What are your thoughts on something like what Netflix is doing and creating physical content environments?
I think it's interesting. What I've heard if they were to do the one they did in Dallas again, I heard they would make it bigger. So obviously there's something to it. And then I think, this tenant kind of in that same vein as the Cosmos up at, what's the area called? We'll get you the area. I'm trying to think of what the area is called, but it's, it's all LED screens. It's the closest thing to the Sphere. It's a lot of backers of Topgolf, but you can go in and watch live sporting events, UFC fights. And we have one of the top digital advertising guys in the country was in our office right after it opened. He goes, you need to see it. It will blow your mind. So there's some entertainment concepts that are newer that are out there on the edge that are going to probably replace, what we think of as theaters. And, I think consumers want stuff on demand, like they want to see it when they want to see it.
Here's my favorite question we ask everybody. Well, what does retail mean to you, like on a personal level?
Well, it's what I do every day. And I've always kind of followed trends. And I think if, like you're trying to figure out trends, sales in this environment that we've been in the last several years. Everyone's trying to figure out if consumption is 70 to 80% of GDP, we play a role in that. And what's our role? Want to provide people jobs, want to grow the tax base. Just opened an IKEA here an hour and a half ago, and we had the governor, we had the mayor's people here. I mean, everyone is thinking about economic development, and that's really important. And, I think that's part of my responsibility is to think about, how can we make the community better, deliver a great product, but also, what role do we play in consumption and the macroeconomics of the U.S. economy?
The last question, what's your advice for aspiring developers who are entering this field where experience, is more important or sometimes than just selling a product?
Everything, that you thought you knew, something new comes up, and so I would say be open-minded. Something, we're tackling right now is, autonomous driving down in Austin, where, I was down there looking at the holiday lights and, delivery, a lot of foods to go now. And so, I talked to our GM the next day and he said, Ward, that's not the problem we have. It's autonomous driving, picking things up like food, or in Nordstrom, people bringing 4 or 5 bags out. So, and just putting them in a driverless car because we have, Waymo and robo-taxis down there. So I just think that, for young people, they're closer to it and they use a lot of this, but I think you've got to be very, very open-minded in the rules of, parking, et cetera. You've got to have some flexibility. You can be the smartest guy in the room, but like there's real stuff starting to happen, and it's even catching us by surprise. So, the fun part is you're learning all the time. The good news about retail, it's been disrupted, right? Since e-commerce came out kind of in 99 and 2000 with Amazon. And you look at other businesses, office, hospitality, where Airbnb's been disrupted. We've been disrupted. So it's like, keep thinking along the lines of disruption. Make sure you have the credit, the financing, and just be thoughtful. Be thoughtful about what you're going to leave to the community instead of just profit, that you want to be a taker. It's got to be mutual. You got to be a giver and a taker. It can't be all one way. So I think be thoughtful and, how does that all play together?
Thank you for your time. That was great. We'll have to have you back maybe as we get close to the holidays.
Yeah.
The second half, we'll have you come back on. So, and thanks for tuning in. Thank you, Ward.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.